Thank you, everyone, for joining for our final panel of the day about firearms in Chicago. I'm going to do a quick round of introductions and then turn it over to our moderator, Professor Levinson. So we have Stephanie Kollmann here today, who's the Policy Director of the Children and Family Justice Center here at the Northwestern Pritzker School of Law. She manages criminal justice research aimed at addressing youth incarceration and regularly advises policymakers across the country on issues of justice reform and implementation. Next, Kofi Ademola is a prison and police abolitionist who is currently an adult advisor for the youth-led violence prevention organization, Good Kids Mad City. He's also a former leader with Black Lives Matter Chicago, where he helped organize for the historic consent decree with the Chicago Police Department that was approved last year in 2019. Zach Fardon is the managing partner of Keegan and Spalding's office here in Chicago. And important to this panel, he served as the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois from 2013 to 2017. Mr. Fardon is also an adjunct professor here at the law school, and where he teaches a seminar on the very topic of this panel, Chicago's gun violence epidemic. Lastly, Sanford Levinson has been a professor at the University of Texas Law School since 1980, where he has written prolifically about many areas of constitutional law and legal history. But really important to today's symposium, his 1989 article called The Embarrassing Second Amendment is one of the seminal pieces of scholarship on this area of law. We're thrilled to have each one of you guys here today. At this point, let me turn it over to Professor Levinson.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this, and thank you for inviting me to moderate it. This panel is obviously somewhat different from the other panels in that the concerns are less highly theoretical or in terms of constitutional interpretation and much more about practical policy, particularly evolving from the experience of the three main speakers with Chicago. Frank Easterbrook wrote an opinion for the Seventh Circuit back in 2010, before McDonald, suggesting that the issue of regulation of guns should be locality sensitive. And I don't think it is a coincidence that Judge Easterbrook not only teaches at the University of Chicago Law School, but also lives in Chicago. So I am delighted to have this opportunity to moderate and, more to the point, learn from three really interesting panelists. I don't know if you've agreed on an order. Usually, if there's no agreement, I tend to go alphabetically. But if you do have an order, please follow it. Seeing no hands, let me call on Kofi Ademola, whose name comes first in the alphabet, and then turn to Zach Fardon, and then Stephanie Kollmann.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
There is no real question. Rather, all of you come from a locality and experiences that focus much more on gun policy than on the intricacies of constitutional theory. So I think that you're really invited to talk about what it is you've observed and learned about the issue of guns, particularly in the city of Chicago, and frankly, what you might like to see happen with regard to guns in Chicago.
Okay, thank you for that framing. I appreciate it. So, not to get too anecdotal, but my personal history is when I was 17, and I'm 40 now. When I was 17, I got caught with a gun, and I was charged with unlawful use of a weapon. It was my first time, but I was charged with a felony, Class X felony. And as you know, that's on my record permanently, right? that kind of pushed me in a trajectory of dealing with the carceral system, but also the perception of who I was as an individual, right? What does that label mean for me? What are the expectations? And I wouldn't find out, till later on in life, about the 1994 crime bill and other legislation. It was very similar, that kind of revisited, how the punitive measures for gun possession for folks who didn't have a FOID card or didn't legally possess guns, and then that sort of double standard of who has access to guns, who's legitimate to be in gun possession, and of course the racialized context of it, and folks who are criminalized for gun possession and the reasons that folks kind of have access to firearms in the first place. So for me, it was a very formative experience at a very early age, without having any prior knowledge about the criminal legal system in regards to gun laws and possession, et cetera. So learning firsthand by going through the courts, being incarcerated at an early age, and dealing with the ramifications and repercussions afterwards, but also being a young person who had lost someone to gun violence, as well as had friends incarcerated for more serious, harms of, actually shooting people and taking people's lives, right? So just having that firsthand knowledge had really, driven me to want to have a better understanding of not only the gun culture here in America, not only, again, the racial targeted, um, you know, legislation that led to mass incarceration, but also the history and culture within that. So that's kind of my perspective on that. And then later on, thinking about, policy and working with folks that have passed some policy around gun laws, but also reframing and reimagining, the punitive measures again, and to deal with more root causes of gun violence and intercommunal violence. And what are some other ways beyond punishing people to deter, violence, and what does that look like? And then briefly, I'll just kind of touch upon, with the gun violence on the rise in Chicago recently, both Mayor Lightfoot, before Superintendent Eddy left, and also current Superintendent Brown, all falsely pointed towards bail reform as an answer to try to place blame on why gun violence was increasing. But the data, from my understanding, showed quite the opposite, that just because folks were, having access to bond or free bail, et cetera, that there wasn't a correlation to a rise in gun violence. Although there were clearly individual examples of offenders who were felons or who had access to guns, who had committed harm again, but that wasn't the majority, and that wasn't the bigger narrative that was being depicted. So I just wanted to say that there's evidence, that supports that, one, incarcerating folks doesn't deter crime, doesn't deter gun violence in particular, and two, that again, false narrative of trying to place blame on that. I'm glad that gets challenged and debunked, but it's still a narrative that's out there. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Great. Zach Fardon, if you'll unmute yourself.
So nice to meet you. Thank you for having me, Kofi and Stephanie. Nice to meet you both. I come at this from a much different perspective, and anxious to hear about, Kofi, where you grew up, and if that was a Cook County prosecution or a federal prosecution. I don't have prepared remarks, but you asked a broad question, and so I'm just going to give you a broad and very personal perspective in that I moved here in 1997 from the South, where I grew up, to join the United States Attorney's Office here as a federal prosecutor, as an assistant U.S. attorney. Here I am 23 years later, still living here. I had the good fortune in the mid 2013s, 13 through 17, of being appointed by President Obama as the U.S. attorney in Chicago. I have, both as an assistant U.S. attorney and as the U.S. attorney, had both programmatic and prosecutive authority and functions when it came to guns and gun violence in the city of Chicago. And I have very strong views, and it's very hard to have and express those views in a short conversation. That's why, as noted earlier, we designed a course at Northwestern to cover all the different important perspectives. But if I had to put a fine point on it, it would be this. We have a profound gun violence problem in the city of Chicago that is not a law enforcement problem. It's a social justice problem, and it's a public health problem, and it's a decades old entrenched problem, and it has some specific manifestations, criteria that I think are not necessarily uniquely Chicago, but in the aggregation really define the problem. The first of which is our gun violence epidemic impacts a limited number of neighborhoods in the city of Chicago, geographically about 8% of the total footprint of the city of Chicago. Those are principally minority neighborhoods, Black and brown populations that are unfairly disproportionately impacted by this gun violence. Those are also neighborhoods that for decades have been disenfranchised, disinvestment, and neglected, frankly, by the city of Chicago. For decades, frankly, dating back to the early part of the 20th century. A lot of gun violence in those neighborhoods is driven by, and the victims are youth. And a lot of youth growing up in those neighborhoods there's a sense of hopelessness, to use the words of former Superintendent Eddie Johnson. There's a sense of hopelessness. They don't necessarily have a pathway, visibility to long-term success and career options as they're growing up in those neighborhoods. And there is, for decades in the city, in my judgment, been this reflexive approach to that gun violence epidemic of, I would say, wavering attention. When there's a spike in the gun violence, there's a high level of attention. When there's an ebb, that attention goes away. And it's also been collectively viewed, I think, generally speaking, as a law enforcement problem. To Kofi's point, there's been an emphasis on gun prosecutions and drug prosecutions, which has resulted in mass incarceration, including disproportionately, obviously, impacting minority communities. And my wife tells me that the definition of crazy is when you want things to change, but you keep doing the same thing over and over. And that's what we've been doing in the city of Chicago for decades now. To Kofi's point about the recent attention from Mayor Lightfoot and the Attorney General about the gun violence statistics in Chicago and the recent spike, the Attorney General came here in August because the numbers in August, after there had been a surge of federal resources to Chicago through what's called Operation Legend, the numbers went down, homicide numbers went down for the month. And he came and in essence engaged in a food fight over who gets credit for that. Well, in September, they went back up and we had the highest gun violence rate that we've had, the highest number of homicides in September that we've had in Chicago since 1993. I mention that because I'm tired of it. I'm tired of the sort of reacting to the ebbs and flows of gun violence when year over year we have an unacceptable number of gun killings in the city of Chicago. And we have this paradigm where it's disproportionately unfairly impacting this limited number of neighborhoods, Black and brown communities, and kids do not have a chance to grow up in those neighborhoods for the most part without being profoundly impacted by that epidemic. Now, law enforcement has a role to play, and I played that role for a while, and there are things that need to be done. And obviously with today's crisis and this reckoning that we've been undertaking, particularly in the wake of Mr. Floyd's murder, that is being revisited, and how we're approaching police and policing, which I think is a welcome reckoning and a welcome revisiting. But there's so much more than just law enforcement that we have to talk about when we talk about gun violence in Chicago. We got to talk about our not-for-profits and how we can better support those, and particularly those that are operating in the most impacted communities. We have to talk relatedly about philanthropy, and there's no shortage, I think, of goodwill and money in the city of Chicago, and yet that goodwill and that money is not strategically targeted the way it needs to be at addressing these problems. And yeah, we have to talk about government, local, state, and federal government, and how it is leaning in and contributing to resolving the epidemic long term. And so all of these critical moving parts need to be brought together and something of a Marshall Plan. And that is what I think is gone neglected and not really manifested in Chicago yet. So with that, I'll kick it over back to you, Professor, and hear from Stephanie.
Okay, Stephanie Kollmann.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I want to say that it can be really difficult for law professors, law students, lawyers, and lawmakers to say that law is not the answer to a problem. And so I want to thank Zach Fardon for saying that this is not primarily a law enforcement issue. I think that's correct. And I think that our role as attorneys, those of us who are, is really to point out when law is not the answer. I think that's a very precious role that we have, and we ought to be forthright about it. I think that I will caution in my remarks probably throughout our conversation about the use of criminal law primarily as a way to address gun violence, and in particular gun carrying, especially with the sorts of penalties that we see in the state of Illinois, and which Kofi discussed being subject to, just sort of to editorialize on the biographical details that he's shared. You know, back when he was 17, all 17-year-olds in the state of Illinois were treated as adults. So he has a permanent felony conviction as an adult for a Class X felony, and that's not expungible. And in the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago, I think we are a laboratory of what the wrong approach to gun violence is, and that is using gun possession as a proxy for gun violent crime, and really doubling, tripling, and septupling down on mandatory minimums and sentencing enhancements as a way of addressing the issue of gun possession in our city. Unlicensed gun possession is a crime that, if you have a gun in public that is loaded and no license in the city of Chicago or anywhere in the state of Illinois, it carries a mandatory minimum prison term. And that penalty is the resultant part of repeated increases every time we have had one of these ebbs and flows that Zach mentioned of attention to gun violence. And by prioritizing the criminal law as the tool with which we primarily respond to it, we have managed to ratchet up the penalties for what, as we've heard on the previous panels today, for some people is considered to be a cherished constitutional right. And you know, throughout the conversation today, I think a lot of people have brought up race as an example. Certainly racial history in America, which I'm glad there was a discussion about how, you know, the country through colonial settlers was sort of taken at gunpoint, and that Black people in this country were subjected and forced to chattel slavery at gunpoint. But still today, what we're seeing in real life is that the right to self-defense, I think, is fictitious for many people. And there's a racial dynamic to that. Not all people are believed to have a right to self-defense. And no one who, I think, advances the idea that there's a personal public possession right to have a gun truly means that, for instance, any of the millions of children who are reported to have been abused in their homes should have lawful gun rights in case someone tries to hurt them. Nobody suggests that any of the people who are subject to excessive force during the course of an arrest ought to be able to defend themselves against that unlawful and excessive use of force with a gun, right? So, and I'm bringing up people who are arrested and people who are children because this is who the Children and Family Justice Center has represented for 30 years. And we've been engaged during that time in representing many young people who have been caught with guns and subjected to extreme penalties for that, including being tried as an adult. And many of the other super predator derived theories that have now mostly been rejected by legal academia and certainly criminologists, but are still unfortunately enshrined in many of our criminal laws. So just wanted to put that out there as a point that we might want to discuss. But I think as we're thinking about self-defense, and which is the only reason that we have a proliferation of guns in public possession, we have a real reality difference between people who are permitted to have a gun based on not having a previous felony conviction, and the people who are most likely to be subject to gun violence, who are legally restricted from being able to possess a gun. So when we're talking about neighborhoods in Chicago that have extremely concentrated, segregated disinvestment, poverty, and high levels of gun violence, the young men in those neighborhoods are almost, well, certainly more than half, are legally prohibited from lawfully possessing a gun. And so at the same time that our constitutional law recognizes some right of self-defense and protection, and the fact that guns can be held in private use for those reasons, the people who in our city, and this is not unlike many areas of the country, are most likely to be killed with a gun and therefore should have, if anyone ought, the right to protect themselves with a gun, are legally prohibited from having that. So it's a central tension in our constitutional thinking about this, that we don't center race and real life risk in our assessment of what ought to be constitutionally allowed behavior. I'll stop there.
Well, thanks to all of you. Let me ask a question, which I hope will generate a discussion. I find a deep paradox in particularly what Stephanie said, that whether, I don't want to say the cure, because I don't think anybody thinks there's a cure for these issues of policy, but whether the wiser policy is to try more or less to get as many guns off the streets as possible by almost any means necessary, or actually to increase access to guns by those who are vulnerable. You mention kids, and for our purposes, I assume you mean 15 and 16-year-olds more than my 9-year-old grandson. Actually, 6-year-old grandson, 9-year-old granddaughter. We are very much involved in a discussion this election season about the fact that convicted felons are in many states denied the right to vote. They're also denied, I believe, under federal law, the right to have a gun. Convicted felons range from Martha Stewart to Timothy McVeigh. And does that particular prohibition sweep too broadly? I have literally no idea whether Mr. Ademola would like a gun or not. But should the fact that at the age of 17, he was convicted of a felony prohibit him for a lifetime from having access to a gun if he believes, for whatever reason, that a gun is conducive to personal security? I'm not making an argument right now in my own voice. I live in Texas, which is one of the many open carry states. I think too many Texans have too many guns, especially with open carry. But I do find the policy issue one on which reasonable people can disagree. And given your own experiences, I'm really eager to hear what your view is about who ought to have access to guns, assuming somebody either should or has a constitutional entitlement to a gun. Zach, do you want to start? As a former prosecutor, I assume you, on occasion, you prosecuted felons.
Yeah,
in
I'm sorry.
possession?
I was having trouble with my mute button, Professor, but I
You're
got it.
fine now. You're fine now.
Good. Okay. No, and I'm eager to hear from Kofi and Stephanie on your great question and questions. I mean, I do maybe want to separate them out a little bit in the sense that there is a separable issue about our prescriptive list of preclusions for convicted felons, whether it's voting, whether it's possession of a firearm. And I do think that we as a country need to rethink that entire approach. What are the sort of goals and objectives of our prosecutive system, our criminal justice system of incarceration, and ultimately of those labels? Because I think disadvantaging re-entering felons by telling them they can't vote and they can't exercise constitutional rights, including the Second Amendment, is, and maybe on a case-by-case basis, there's some justification for those rules. But I think as a across-the-board prescription, it strikes me as part of the problem and not part of the solution. That to me is a separable issue from your fundamental question about, are we better off, and I'm going to focus on the city of Chicago, by making firearms more rather than less available. I mean, I'll be very blunt and say, I don't think if I focus on the issue of trying to do what can be done to eradicate the gun violence epidemic in Chicago. And that's a generational challenge. That's not a 3-year or 5-year plan. It can't be. It has to be kind of looking down to my kids and beyond, ultimate resolution of that issue. And realistically, we're not going to be able to get the guns off the streets of Chicago. We have porous borders. It is easy right now to get on the Interstate 94, drive into Indiana, hit a gun show, have an ID, even a fake ID, buy a duffel bag full of handguns and drive back to Chicago. And there's no way to stop it shy of, setting up roadblocks. And we're not gonna do that. And I mean, it would be easier, I think, easier to get all the fish out of Lake Michigan than it would to get all the guns off the streets of the city of Chicago. And I do think I defer to and look forward to hearing from Kofi on this, but I believe that a lot of young folks in those neighborhoods carry, a very high percentage of young men in those neighborhoods, including teenage boys in those neighborhoods, carry, and they're good kids. And they're not carrying because they're looking to do anything bad. They're carrying because they don't want to be caught naked. There is a feeling and perception that it is necessary from a safety perspective, which really goes to your point. To me, we got to figure out a way to get past that. I don't want teenagers carrying because they feel like they have to protect themselves in the city of Chicago or anywhere in the United States of America. And in fact, to me, that's so profoundly un-American that anyone would have to live in that environment and that society in this country is very unsettling to me. So I'm back to Judge Easterbrook's opinion that you mentioned earlier. I absolutely think it would be more than rational to have some, geographic component to how far government is able to regulate gun possession. I also think that, and I'm sorry that I missed the rest of the symposium today, but I think a lot more can and needs to be done in terms of regulating gun possession. But most of the gun violence in the city of Chicago attendant to this epidemic that I've been describing are pistols and handguns. We're not talking about, AR-15s and fully automated weapons with heavy round clips, all of which to me, I don't have any idea why you're able to use those in the United States of America or possess those in the United States of America. And I do think so long as we have a Second Amendment and a right to bear arms, that folks are going to have the ability and right to have handguns, which are the weapon of choice when you're talking about Chicago's gun violence epidemic. So that's a long way of saying neither. I don't think that we want more guns so that people can protect themselves with guns and that'll have some kind of deterrent effect, nor do I think we realistically should focus on the removal or, eradication of guns in the city of Chicago, because it's not realistic and it's not going to solve the long-term problems. And I view it as a little bit of a distraction from the other things that we talked about, our racial reckoning, inequality, including financial inequities in the city of Chicago, education, disenfranchisement, all of these social injustices that I do think feed the sense of hopelessness that impacts kids growing up in those neighborhoods. Those are separate and I think deserve our attention in a way that can be wasted if we focus unduly on gun regulation. So sorry if that's long-winded, but that's—
No, thank you very much. I'm going to refer to the rest of you by your first names also, and please refer to me as Sandy, not Professor Levinson. You're not in class. Kofi, I'd be interested in your response.
Yeah, no, I appreciate everything that Zach just said. And to go back to a statement that Stephanie made earlier about the colonial roots in violence. And then just for me specifically thinking about, what the Second Amendment was rooted in, as far as slave catchers, white men being able to arm themselves to create militias against slave rebellions. And then, the history of slave catchers and, how the police essentially got created. So I guess I'm going to bring it back to more of a macro level, and I have questions around that. And then I'll bring it into some history for myself, and then kind of talk about some policy that we're actually proposing right now that we believe can be part of the solution to bring down a lot of the violence that's happening. Because here in Chicago, we've had over 3,000 people shot, and sadly, 12 children 10 years old and younger have been shot this year, which is unprecedented, with so many babies and just children being shot. So I guess my broader question is just American society and culture in general. For me, I don't see how we talk about gun violence in a vacuum when we talk about intracommunal violence or even mass shootings or intimate partner violence without, one, examining patriarchy and looking at the role that patriarchy has played in that, and then toxic masculinity and how that has also played a major role in that. But on a structural level, just the violence that America perpetuates through imperialism, through the military industrial complex, that has a direct correlation and impact on the culture and the values of the people in the United States. So if I'm a young person and I enlist at 18 and I'm asked to kill for my country, clearly that's an acceptable form of violence. Whereas again, if I'm in a urban environment and I'm trying to defend myself with the example that I believe Zach made, right, and I'm just carrying a gun out of self-defense or fear for my life, but not necessarily to harm anyone, yet I'll be criminalized for that. So we have to deal with those contradictions of American militarism and the proliferation of guns. I would say really is attributed to the defense contracts and the manufacturers making so many guns for the police and for the military. That's really where the mass proliferation is coming from. And then it goes down to the individual citizen looking to arm themselves for whatever different reasons. So I would just say that we need to kind of struggle with that contradiction on a macro level and talk about that history and the continued history of colonial violence and imperialism. I just personally can't look at gun violence in a vacuum. To me, it's all interconnected. But more specifically in the history of Chicago, I'm always fascinated with the 60s, because the 60s, there was an opportunity to really empower young people, specifically Black and brown young people, to do violence prevention work and to actually improve their communities. And we saw that with the Vice Lords, we saw that with the Blackstones, and we saw that more so with the Black Panther Party. And just to be short, the Vice Lords, they had a community center. They had a clothing store. They were in Lawndale. And when Martin Luther King came to visit Chicago, he built a rapport and relationships with them. They ended up being part of his security detail. Later on, when the LSD, the Lord, Stones, and Disciples came together, they organized 20,000 young people to demand jobs for young people, right? Operation Breadbasket, and Jesse Jackson, unfortunately, gets credit for that. But it was actually young people, they were labeled gang members, et cetera, that organized that. But with the Vice Lords that had 10,000 young people on the West Side, they stirred them in a different direction. So between 68 and like 70, you saw a dramatic drop in crime. And as a result of that, that was because of they were engaged with, programs for young people. They were deterring the violence, and, they were able to economically have some stability. The same thing with the Black Panther Party. They had the survival programs where they, had the free breakfast program, and they had a free health, a healthcare system, and all of these things were, going towards, improving folks, giving young people opportunities. The same thing with the Blackstones and Woodlawn. But what we saw, right, was again this criminalization. So you had, Mayor Daley Sr., you had the state's attorney at the time, you had, the president at the time. All of them, came together along with, COINTELPRO, but specifically in Chicago, that's when they created the gang task force. They pressured the corporations like Sears and Roebuck, and I forget the other companies, to stop funding the programs. There was a federal investigation launched against Jeff Ford around, the mishandling of funds. So, and you saw leadership and the Vice Lords get targeted. And, a few of them got incarcerated, a few of them got killed. As we know, both Fred Hampton and Mark Clark were murdered, viciously assassinated by the Chicago Police Department with over 100 shots into their houses, right, into their house. So I say all that to say that there was a huge opportunity in the late 60s and early 70s to really transform how community engagement happened and how young people who were organizing themselves. We have to keep in mind that, the Vice Lords organized themselves in 1957, while being in a juvenile detention center, essentially. Larry Hoover was 13 when he first started organizing. David Barksdale with the Blackstone Disciples was very young. Jeff Fort was very young. These were teenagers. These were preteens and teenagers organizing their entire community. And we had an opportunity to push them in a way that they weren't engaging in criminal activity, which I would call survival activity. Instead, we went the opposite direction. We targeted them, we broke them up, we disenfranchised them, we criminalized them. And then, come the 80s, you would have the so-called war on drugs, which we know is a policy around a war on Black people. So in that context, we've had 50 plus years of disinvestment, disenfranchisement, marginalizing these communities, and there has been no healing. There's been a constant barrage that Zach talked about with just policing and incarcerating folks, police shooting and killing and brutalizing people, and the community, never having the opportunity to heal. So we have a different approach. We want to look at what the Panthers did. We want to look at what, the Vice Lords and other people did. We have this ordinance called the Peacebook Ordinance, where essentially we're trying to divest from policing. We want to reallocate 2% of Chicago Police Department's budget into our Peacebook Ordinance, which would be centered in restorative justice, healing, and empowering the community to build peace and hold peace treaties, and not just do violence interruption, but do a day-to-day effort of building peace in these communities, right? So absolutely, we're not going to be able to, especially with no real federal legislation around guns, no real consequences for manufacturers and distributors, until we get to that kind of conversation and level. Zach was absolutely right. You're not going to stop the flow of guns in Chicago. But what you can do is curb the intention. If we can educate young men that they can live healthy, sustainable lives without behaving with toxic masculinity, if we can do conflict resolution and restorative justice and transformative justice, if we can get young people resources, economic resources, and really invest in their communities and give them resources for the trauma and the mental health and all these other type of things, we know that there are solutions to really bringing the violence down. You know, October is Intimate Partner Awareness Month, right? We know how many women and women identified folks, trans women, etc., are harmed by men, and there's a correlation between intimate partner violence and gun violence. So you know, we have solutions, but we have to struggle with the contradiction that America is built off of patriarchy, it's built off colonialism and capitalism, and those dominant institutions and systems trickle down and hurt, you know, poor Black and brown folks, indigenous folks the most. So until we interrogate and talk about that, then we're just going to be in this constant loop of violence. But folks that aren't impacted directly by that violence get to look at it from afar. So to me, that's where we're at.
Thank you, Stephanie.
I'm going to answer the question as the solution is fewer guns, but it's not at the cost of expanding police power. And in fact, I think reducing the role of law enforcement in this question could be part of a virtuous cycle in a broader disarmament. You know, one of the things that Alice Ristroff mentioned earlier today, and I thought was excellent, was the ways in which our commitment to allowing guns to be held privately actually has led to an arms race, not only in the fact that we can only conceive of police officers as armed, but what she spoke of this morning too was the way that our other constitutional rights can be abrogated. So the Fourth Amendment, the First Amendment. And again, when it comes to people's right to privacy, right not to be searched, right to assemble, right to speech, all of the things that we hold dear, it is young, primarily Black people in Chicago, some Latinx youth as well, who are policed in specifically those ways. So their associations are criminalized and termed gang conduct. Their public gatherings are also considered to be loitering, gang loitering, and also criminalized. And moreover, the sort of status quo of how policing is done in the city of Chicago is that there is no meaningful community control over police, and that is still the case. And at the as the consent decree continues, hopefully more mechanisms for that are created, but I don't think anyone actually envisions this as being a near-term outcome. And what that means is that young people are able to be demanded to lift their shirts and expose their waistbands when they're walking home from school every day as the price of not getting touched by an adult. And for young people who've already been exposed to not only gun trauma, but in many cases, sexual trauma and domestic violence inside the home, maybe, this is just the day-to-day experience of policing is itself traumatic, and having police that are focused on removing weapons is not an effective use of resources. The Chicago Police Department is very public every year about the number of weapons that it takes off the street. It's about 10,000 a year we're up to. But that's not even a replacement value for the size and strength of the gun industry and the number of weapons that are coming into the city. So concentrating on a seizure law is not going to get us there. which is not to say that this should be a lawful or encouraged or supported behavior. It's a risky behavior to carry a gun. It's increases your risk of behaving belligerently when you're confronted with a threat. And if you have a trauma history and you are legitimately concerned of confronting a threat in your daily life, it leads to inherently dangerous conditions for everyone in a neighborhood, even as violence tends to be concentrated within smaller networks. It's something that absolutely affects everyone. So when it comes to viewing this as a public health crisis, which many politicians do speak of, but when the rubber hits the road in terms of investment and policy that follows that, it becomes a little bit more politically dicey, because you don't want to tell people that possessing guns is socially undesirable behavior. And you don't want to tell people that walking around being armed might not be the best use of their constitutional right, as currently defined at least. So I think what we can do is measures like public health campaigns. Certainly, none of the people I think who are probably listening to this conversation are refraining from drunk driving because they're intimately familiar with the criminal sentence in their respective state for doing that. I think there's other things that stop them before that point, which is the threat to their own health and safety, the threat to their reputation, the threat to the health and safety of other people, and the fact that they perceive this accurately. I don't think we perceive the actual threat of gun carrying accurately in this country, and I think one way that criminalization distorts people's perceptions is that we don't have, I think, when people hear that 10,000 guns were seized last year in the city of Chicago, they assume that a dent has been made in that problem. They don't have a perspective of how many hundreds of thousands of guns are available to people without a license in the city. They don't understand how normative it is in terms of behavior, though inherently dangerous, as I said, for people to arm themselves because they reasonably perceive themselves to be at risk. And so this criminalization of a small slice does tend to distort broader perceptions of the size and scope and nature of the problem, and therefore the types of solutions we can envision. The city of Chicago has more police per capita than almost any other city in the country, and we are still dealing with this problem. The city of Chicago has less control over police, perhaps, than most places in the country, but it's also true that people who are residents of the city know for a fact that 9 out of 10 times, if you shoot someone in the city of Chicago, you will not be arrested for that shooting. The case closure rate of the Chicago Police Department is so low, abysmally low compared to other cities, and that's a function of trust, but it's also, it's a recursive relationship, you know. People don't trust police to keep them safe, and so they settle disputes, or more likely to perceive themselves as needing to settle disputes and protect their own safety. And this mistrust is cyclical. So when it comes to how to reshift our attention, I think we ought to reduce guns and their proliferation in the city of Chicago and in the country. But I do think that we underestimate the value, because it's considered so politically toxic, of things like repealing PLCA, which is the federal law that prevents the gun industry from being sued, similar to how the tobacco industry was sued. And if those suits went forward, we would understand a lot more about how the nature of policing and the gun industry itself are related. There's someone I was speaking to just yesterday about how one of the bad apple dealers that's generically known around close to the city of Chicago, many so-called crime guns, and I say so-called because many crime guns actually were only possessed and not used in a violent crime, but many of those guns come from a few specific dealers. Well, Chicago police are awarded allowance to go purchase their own handgun and also support this dealer. Now, if I were the city of Chicago, I would make sure that I was not supporting the dealer in which most crime guns are coming with my law enforcement dollars. So I think there are a lot of other ways to view this that hold the people who are making a living off a very good living, not small numbers of, trades here and there, with the average straw purchaser possibly doing it 3 times a year and is living at more of a subsistence level and just has very few options economically. I don't think that's really the people that we need to be targeting when we're thinking about disrupting the gun trade in this country. And I think Kofi's point about the war machine is really apt. I know this seems a little bit far afield, but think about what it's like to be a young person today. Your entire life, if you're 18 years old, we have been at war. Guns have been normalized in a way that they are not historically normalized in the life of most everyday Americans. In Illinois, our gun violence has increased exponentially after concealed carry was made state law. And that's not an unusual pattern, but we were one of the last states to adopt a concealed carry regime, and we didn't become a may issue state. We became a shall issue state. And it has changed at a rapid pace what acceptable culture and the number of guns and the acceptability of having guns is among not just young people, but certainly in particular, there's a lot of pressure on young people to adhere to what our broader culture and business interests are. So I think we need to focus a lot of attention on those methods, in addition to the huge public health crisis of trauma and being able to make sure that people have supports to heal and recover from that.
Thank you. I want to move on to some of the questions I've received. I'm assuming that we're going to go roughly another 15 minutes or so, which would be 5 minutes beyond the allotted time, but I think we started roughly 10 minutes late. Let me confess that I still see a tension between macro policy and micro policy. That is to say, I suspect we might agree on what long-term objectives would be, but we also have to think, obviously, a very short-run policy. So when I hear suggestions about whether it's called defunding the police or simply reallocating some money from the police budget to other agencies and to rely more on the community to police itself, the kind of notion or fantasy, depending on your own political views, that we saw played out in Seattle, at least for several weeks. Presumably, there will be some amount of wrongdoing or law breaking, whatever you want to call it. And so then the question is, should the community have arms as a means of law enforcement or norm enforcement, or should the community be disarmed? Because Kofi mentioned the Black Panthers. I remember them reasonably well, at least from a distance, but certainly in the 1960s. I think they were noteworthy for doing a number of things. One was what we would call community service, but another thing was arming themselves and marching to the California state capitol with open arms in order to make it visible that African American men had access to arms and knew how to use them. So again, in the short run, to what extent is the replacement for armed police armed civilians? Or would you say, no, if the community is given the capacity and the trust to run themselves, then they won't need firearms? A question for Zach is what you think of the effectiveness of federal programs like Project Safe Neighborhood or Ceasefire and Operation Trigger Lock. And I assume Stephanie would be familiar with those programs as well. Have they had positive effect, negative effect, or no effect?
So, Sandy, I'll answer that question, but I also want to kind of relate it back to your macro micro question. I do think, and again, we all have our perspective that we bring to this table in our life experience. Mine is half of a 30-year career inside the Justice Department and half as a lawyer outside of the Justice Department. And when I was with the Justice Department, and particularly when I was the U.S. Attorney, I oversaw Project Safe Neighborhoods, which I think is a net positive. It was never designed to be a panacea. It was never expected to correct the issues that those neighborhoods suffer. Having said that, what Project Safe Neighborhoods is effectively both a resource mechanism to allocate and cross-populate prosecutive teams and investigative teams in those neighborhoods with federal and local law enforcement in a way that would be more strategic, tailored, and thoughtful about how those resources are being used for the prosecutive function, but also having reentry services and sessions for felons returning to those neighborhoods to allow them to both tap those resources, not-for-profit resources that would help them find a job or otherwise prepare a resume and simple life services returning from incarcerations to reorient them to the neighborhoods, and also give them points of connectivity to hopefully avoid a pattern of recidivism. So that is part of what Project Safe Neighborhoods does and has done for 20 plus years. And I think that's laudable. And again, I'm sure there's probably some statistical data about success of the program. And I think it generally reflects a net positive. I've never viewed it and don't view it as a panacea or something that we can view as a solution from a macro perspective to the problem. I do think, which brings me to your macro micro point. I do not think that arming more people is the right answer under any circumstance. And I'm glad Stephanie raises the consent decree in the Chicago Police Department. And I understand different people are going to have different perspectives about defunding the police and what that means and what would be sort of the alternative to the police force as we currently understand it. My view of it is sort of intimate, but also simple. And that is the police department is a condition precedent to a successful long-term solution for gun violence in the city of Chicago. You have to have an effective police department. The problem is our police department has not only not been effective, impactful the way it needs to be, it's been, if anything, protective of a status quo that, to Kofi's point, for so long has sanctioned racism and abuse, dating back to the 1919 race riots in the city of Chicago, where the police rode along with white protesters who were seeking to drive out blacks moving into the loop in the city of Chicago. Decade over decade, the Chicago Police Department has had controversy after controversy related to race and abuse of force and disparate impact from an investigative and a prosecutive perspective. I was the U.S. Attorney when we launched the pattern and practice investigation at the Department of Justice. I stood on the dais when Loretta Lynch on January 13th of 2017 announced the findings from that Justice Department investigation. I was part of that, and I was woefully dismayed when this administration walked away from that and forced the state and the city to get together and seek this consent decree in federal court. I'm grateful that happened. I'm grateful there is a consent decree, but we have to have and there's a tremendous amount of detail beneath the surface of this. We have to have a police department that is strong and effective in terms of investigating crimes where crimes are occurred and a solve rate. Stephanie talks about the number of guns taken off the street and how that's really not moving the needle. And I agree with that. Our solve rate is dismal. We're sort of top of country when it comes to taking guns off the streets, bottom of country when it comes to our solve rate for those homicides. We need police to be able to effectively do that job, but we also need police to not view everything as a nail. I mean, they're trained as hammers and they see everything as a nail. We need a police and a police department that understands the distinction between a mental health situation and crisis in a crime situation. We need police who do understand and have intimacy with their communities in a manner that will allow them to develop trust and relationships so that the people can trust police and thereby not need to, Sandy, revert to this notion of self-policing and arming themselves to protect their neighborhoods. It's absolutely, the question is well placed because that is absolutely where we are and where we have been for a long time. But I do think that we have to look to our institutions to enable long-term solutions. And I think if we ignore that in the near term, we're just delaying those solutions. So I do feel like the consent decree is enormously important, and we should never have a conversation about gun violence in the city of Chicago without talking about that Chicago consent decree. And other major cities do have much more impactful and effective police departments, one of them being Los Angeles, which also went under a consent decree in the wake of the Rodney King beatings in the 1990s, and today stands much more powerful and effective in terms of its police function in that community. We can get to a better place, but people have to pay attention to it and have to support it and have to, I think, push it along, particularly as administrations change both locally and federally.
Kofi, do you have any views about Project Safe Neighborhood in particular, or about the consent decree?
Yeah, so, with Chicago, I believe we're at 70% violation of the consent decree. It just hasn't been enforced like it needs to be. And to Stephanie's earlier point around, community oversight, I personally support an ordinance that the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression has been trying to get enacted in Chicago for over 30 years, if I'm not mistaken. It's called CPAC, Civilian Police Accountability Council, where essentially community members will be democratically elected to a board that will have complete oversight on hiring and firing practices, accountability, and what that relationship kind of looks like. But I would also point us to the UK, where they have issues of racism, within their institutions as well. But the huge difference is, they're not armed, right? So you have major cities, you have big cities. We're talking about, countries with high dense populations, but they're not armed. The police clearly have access to guns and very specific high risk situations, but for the most part, your beat officer doesn't have a gun on them, right? Gun violence is very low in the UK, Japan, and other countries we can point to where you don't have your police force, running around with guns, because it is a matched energy, right? And again, it goes back to the culture. I would want us to really differentiate between, a person on a community level, somebody who becomes an officer, someone who becomes enlisted in the military. I would say that they pretty much have same cultural values and backgrounds if they just, take on American culture at face value and they're not interrogating and challenging it. So my thing wouldn't be thinking about an armed citizenry, right? Not looking at, replacing police with, a militia or vigilantes or things of that nature. It's really an interrogation of the mentality and the culture of, what it means to be an armed force, right? How this punitive nature that we've been accustomed to, that punishment is the way to deal with harm, versus, a restorative process. So a lot of the intracommunal violence that happens is revenge based. Someone killed someone I'm close to, and therefore I'm retaliating. That becomes sort of the cycle of violence, and there's no disruption in that. So it doesn't matter if you lock up person A and person B. That anger, that trauma, that frustration is still dispersed amongst a bigger group. So even though you've locked up these particular individuals, you haven't disrupted the violence. And it just gets, passed on almost like a virus, right? And that's why folks have said we need to examine it from a public health issue, perspective, I should say, not a law enforcement perspective. So for a lot of us that are on the side of abolition and looking to defund police, it's really about dismantling institutions that we feel like as though perpetuate harm. We believe prisons perpetuate gender-based violence. We believe police perpetuate violence. That the institution is inherently violent from its history to its standing in the community now. It's not about good cops, bad cops. It's not about individual officers and their behaviors. It's about the very nature of criminalizing folks, warehousing folks, and then the gender-based violence that happens within these, behind prison walls and behind jail walls, not just by those that are incarcerated, but also by the state. So for us, it is reimagining this entire idea of how do we mitigate harm? How do we deal with people that perpetrate harm and are survivors or victims of harm? And how do we reallocate resources to actually go to the healing and support of those that have been harmed versus having a punitive nature towards those that have committed harm? How do we reintegrate folks back into society that have committed harm? How do we hold them accountable? I think those are the questions that when we're looking through a lens of transformative justice and pulling out of the carceral system, that's where the answers lie for us. And it goes back to that intentionality of my need to even pick up a gun and what's the point of having arms, right? Who is a threat? Why do I consider someone a threat? And am I under this capitalist notion of private property that I must defend, right? So to me, it goes back down to our values, our institutions. And as long as, we have this individualistic, selfish society that is, completely integrated with sexism, racism, ableism, and all of these, divisive things, is going to be inherently violent. When our country goes to other countries to proliferate, to steal resources and to bomb and harm folks, that creates the culture of violence that the rest of us deal with on a daily basis. Some of us more closely to it, and some of us from a further distance. But at the end of the day, to me, it speaks to who we are in this country. And we have the opportunity to change that. And we imagine how we treat one another and focus more on radical love and transformative justice versus more punishment and more death.
Thank you. Stephanie, perhaps you can take us home. And let me return to your opening remarks with a very specific example of kids who've been victims of abuse. So one response might be that the abusers should either get more treatment, therapy, or whatever, or be criminally punished. In the absence of a criminal justice system or a social services system that adequately responds to child abusers, what is your own view about, let us say, a 14-year-old who thinks it desirable to have a gun in order to protect herself or himself against abuse?
I think that, and this is picking up on one of the questions that is in the chat as well, sort of what is the system response for gun possession? What ought it be? Because that's not an unusual circumstance. It is a little bit unusual that a young person would want to possess a gun because of a threat faced within their home rather than as a consequence of a threat faced within their home, but just taking it as it is. We are, as a society, not focused on making young people's lived reality safer. And it is hard for me as someone who does not face a personal high risk of gun violence to imagine what that is, or interpersonal violence, and what a proper or reasonable child would respond when they've had the experiences that they've had and are in the current living conditions that they may be in. What I would say is, when the criminal justice system does, and it will continue for the foreseeable future to do when it encounters a young person in that situation, we have to address what's happening. One of the projects that someone else at my office recently did was a large-scale discussion with young people from both incarcerated and in the communities where most incarcerated young people come from. And over, one of the things that they heard back from those young people was, nobody ever asked me why. And that is not what our criminal justice system or our juvenile justice system, and I think they're effectively the same. Our legal responses are not problem-solving responses. And we can call a court a problem-solving court, but that doesn't get us there either. When young people are not consulted about how to solve their own problems, we miss the information that we need in order to effectively solve those problems. Young people are experts in their own lives. They may not be experts in the entire social meaning. They certainly are not experts in criminal law, but they are experts in their lived conditions. And too often those voices are completely absent from all policymaking, but even in individual discussions of how a case progresses. And when we have political responses that say things like, young people who carry guns are inherently dangerous, they're violent, it was really exciting to me to hear Zach say, as a former prosecutor even, specifically, these are good kids, right? I absolutely agree with that. Young people who carry guns are overwhelmingly doing them for the same reason everyone else is, and we need to understand what threats they believe they're facing and how to change both their perception of those threats, because it is inflated in some cases by trauma, but also the reality of those threats. And if the reality is that their neighborhood isn't safe, then we have to make it safe. And that's a failure of adults. And I don't mean the adults in their lives who get for failing to overcome a system of generational disinvestment and racism, but I mean, as a society, we owe young people better. And so I think that's where our attention ought to go, in addition to really investigating what this industry is doing in terms of who it's targeting, including targeting for violence.
Thank you. I think the acid test of a successful symposium is that everybody is frustrated when their particular panel comes to an end, because so much more could be said. I think that's been true since 9 o'clock this morning in the first of the panels. So let me thank the three of you for certainly contributing to my education. And I suspect I can speak for those who are listening in and observed, and unfortunately call an end to this really, really interesting panel, because all things have to come to an end.
Thank you, Professor Levinson, and thank you to each of these panelists. What a great conversation, albeit definitely a frustrating one at points, to cap off the day. Thank you to all who have joined. We really appreciate it. We'll have videos up of the symposium here in the coming weeks. Thank you again. And the print edition that many of our panelists spoke about their forthcoming essays will come out next year in volume 116, issue 1 of the Northwestern University Law Review. Thank you all, and thank you also to the Duke Center for Firearms Law on partnering with us for this symposium. Thanks again.